Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Hope Spencer no way imagined that a simple DNA test, ordered in a moment of quiet mistrustfulness and buried fear, would unravel the veritably foundation of her identity, but when the results came back, they exploded like a lemon planted deep within the Forrester-Spencer birth, exposing a treason so profound that indeed the fabulous dishonors of Los Angeles couture blanched in comparison. Because this wasn't just another affair or power heist, this was family deception written into Hope's veritably DNA, and at the center of it all stood Eric Forrester, the primogenitor whose name was synonymous with heritage, honor, and the imperturbable belief that blood defined fortune, yet the verity revealed that Eric had carried a secret for decades, one he believed was buried ever, a secret that intertwined Brooke Logan, destabilized Ridge Forrester's moral high ground, and shattered Hope's understanding of who she was and where she came from, because the test didn't just raise questions, it screamed them, showing an inheritable link that should have been insolvable, forcing Hope to defy the horrifying possibility that the man she had always regarded as family in one way was connected to her in another, interdicted way, and as whispers turned into allegations and allegations into competitions, the history rose like a ghost demanding to be conceded, revealing that times agone, during a period of heartache, ambition, and moral concession, Eric had crossed a line that could no way be uncrossed, sharing, whether deliberately or through manipulation, in a web of falsehoods designed to cover reports at the cost of verity, and Brooke, who had spent her life oscillating between tone-righteous honesty and disastrous secretiveness, was suddenly forced to face the unpretty glass of all, one that reflected not just her miscalculations but her conspiracy in allowing a child, Hope, to grow up believing a story that wasn't entirely real. While Ridge, torn between fury and denial, plotted to attune his devotion to family consanity with the sickening consummation that everything he'd defended, every moral lecture he'd delivered, was now undercut by the blood substantiation screaming from a laboratory report, and Hope, sweet Hope, the woman who erected her entire sense of tone around the belief that love, integrity, and translucency could overcome any darkness, set up herself drowning in treason so absolute that it hovered to extinguish the veritably sanguinity she was named for, because this wasn't just about biology, it was about choice, about the decision by important grown-ups to rewrite reality and let an innocent child live inside a precisely constructed taradiddle, and as Hope demanded answers, each disclosure only strengthened the crack, exposing secret meetings, altered documents, and a silent agreement among those who claimed to love her utmost that some trueness were too dangerous to reveal, and Eric, once the wise elder, now stood as a woeful figure visited by remorse, realizing too late that guarding the family name had bring him the family's soul, while Steffi and Thomas watched the chaos unfold with a blend of exculpation and horror, knowing that this disclosure would permanently alter power dynamics at Forrester Creations, as trust eroded and alliances shifted, and Liam, caught between his instinct to cover Hope and his incapability to completely grasp the magnitude of her pain, plotted to reach her as she questioned whether love itself could survive in a world erected on deception, and as the fallout gurgled outward, old battles were reignited, past sins redefined, and long-buried recollections dragged into the light, forcing every character to choose between continuing the taradiddle for comfort or embracing the verity no matter how ruinous, because in the end, the DNA test from hell did further than expose a shocking family treason. It forced Hope Spencer to review herself not by the blood that betrayed her, but by the strength it took to face the verity, and while the secret changed her ever, it also set the stage for a new period in which the vision of perfection girding the Forrester and Logan dynasties eventually cracked, revealing that indeed in the most glamorous world, the most dangerous secrets are the bones rumored within families, passed down through generations, and written into the veritably genes that refused to stay silent. As the shockwaves from the DNA test continued to resonate through every marble hallway and glass-walled office of Forrester Creations, the fallout evolved from rumored unbelief into an each-consuming reckoning, because once the secret was exposed, it refused to remain contained, and Hope Spencer set up herself at the center of a storm that grew more violent with every fleeting hour, her formerly gentle faith in family and love now replaced by a eating sense of disturbance, as if the ground beneath her had cracked open and revealed that everything she had ever stood on was unstable, and while Eric Forrester tried to retreat into silence, cloaking himself in remorse and vague justifications, it snappily came clear that guilt alone could undo decades of manipulation, deletions, and calculated choices that had rewritten history for everyone involved, especially Hope, who now replayed her entire life through a new, ruinous lens. Questioning every smile, every consolation, every moment she had been told she was cherished for exactly who she was, because the consummation that she had been defended not out of love but out of fear, fear of reproach, fear of collapse, fear of exposure, cut deeper than any verity she could have imagined, and Brooke Logan, who had formerly flattered herself on surviving public judgment and arising stronger, now faced a reckoning far more brutal than tabloid captions or romantic treason, because this time the person harmed most by her choices was her own son, and as Brooke tried to justify her silence with pulsing explanations about securing Hope's future, her words chimed concave against the inarguable fact that Hope's history had been finagled, curated, and sanitized without her concurrence, and Ridge Forrester, whose identity was thick from the heritage of Eric, set up himself unraveling as he plotted to attune his fidelity to his father with the crushing mindfulness that the moral compass he'd inherited was unnaturally defective, leading him to lash out in wrathfulness not just at Eric and Brooke but at himself for having defended a system that thrived on secretiveness while condemning others for far lower. And as the family splintered under the weight of exposures, Hope's pain strengthened into commodity more dangerous than grief, clarity, because she began to see how frequently verity had been offered at the balcony of power, how constantly women like her had been asked to endure confusion so that men like Eric could save authority and myth, and this consummation burned a quiet fury within her, one that frightened indeed those who allowed they knew her stylish, including Liam, whose attempts to offer comfort only emphasized how alone Hope truly was, because no quantum of love could bridge the gap between who she allowed she was and who she now knew she might be, and as she demanded full translucency, averring on answers no bone wanted to give, the secrets continued to unravel like a thread pulled too hard, exposing not just the circumstances girding her generality but a broader pattern of deception that stretched across generations, revealing how Forrester history itself had been shaped by falsehoods disguised as protection. And when Steffi brazened Eric directly, her voice shaking with a blend of rage and unbelief, she articulated what everyone differently stressed to say audibly, that the family conglomerate they had all fought to defend was erected on picky verity, and that by choosing silence, Eric had tutored them that heritage signified further than honesty, and Thomas, watching Hope reclaim her voice with a strength he'd no way seen ahead, was forced to defy his own history of manipulation, fating that the culture of secretiveness that had enabled his worst conduct was the same bone that had burgled Hope of her right to her own story, and as the reproach revealed beyond the family and into the public eye, hanging Forrester Creations' character and fiscal stability, the question shifted from damage control to moral survival, because for the first time, the family couldn't simply spin the narrative or distract with glamour, and Hope, refusing to be silenced or softened, made a choice that stunned everyone. She stepped down from the part she had been prepped to play, distancing herself from the company, the name, and the prospects that had defined her majority, declaring that until the verity was completely conceded, she'd no longer share in maintaining a vision that had bring her sense of tone, and this decision marked a turning point not just for Hope but for the entire bold and the beautiful macrocosm, because it forced every character to defy what they valued more, the comfort of tradition or the courage to face the consequences of verity, and Eric, stripped of his authority and forced to defy the reality that love without honesty was concave, eventually began to understand that the topmost treason wasn't the secret itself but the belief that others were too fragile to handle it, and as Hope walked down from the life she formerly trusted, she carried with her a pain that would no way completely fade but also a strength forged in fire, because while the DNA test from hell had shattered her history, it also freed her from living inside a taradiddle, setting the stage for a future where identity was mandated by pedigrees corrupted by fear but by the integrity she chose to claim for herself, and in that moment, as the sun set over Los Angeles and the Forrester manse stood quieter than it ever had ahead, one verity remained inarguable: the secret that was meant to cover the family had rather converted it ever, and Hope Spencer, no longer defined by deception, came the living consequence of a heritage that could no longer hide from the verity written in its own DNA. In the weeks that followed Hope Spencer's quiet but seismic pullout from the life she formerly knew, the fate of the DNA disclosure didn't fade into memory or settle into uneasy acceptance as so numerous dishonors before it had, but rather metastasized into commodity far more sharp, because formerly verity had been spoken audibly, it demanded consequences, and Hope, now standing at the edge of her own identity, began to witness a profound reckoning that went beyond wrathfulness or heartache and entered the realm of empirical loss, as she woke each morning scuffling with the unsettling consummation that the narrative she had lived by, the story of who her parents were, what values they had passed down, and how love had shaped her was not simply defective but designedly finagled, and this mindfulness colored every commerce, every memory, every inherited belief, forcing her to defy the reality that indeed her sanguinity, the veritably particularity that had made her a lamp of light in a world defined by contest and treason, had been weaponized by others as evidence that she could handle the taradiddle, while they shouldered the burden of knowing better, and as Hope tried to erect together a new sense of tone outside the gravitational pull of the Forrester and Logan dynasties, she set up that distance didn't bring peace so much as clarity, because removed from the constant noise of heritage, anticipation, and obligation, she could eventually see the patterns that had governed her life, including how frequently she had been encouraged to forgive without full exposure, to move forward without all the data, and to place the emotional comfort of others above her own need for verity, and this consummation brought with it a stewing grief, not just for what she had lost but for the interpretation of herself that had been molded to accept half-answers as love, and meanwhile, back at the Forrester manse, the family that had formerly flattered itself on adaptability set up itself fractured in ways that no hostile preemption or romantic triangle had ever achieved, as Eric Forrester, now stripped of his moral authority, wandered through the halls like a relic of a defunct period, visited by the faces of those he'd induced himself he was guarding, only to realize that his interpretation of protection had been a form of control, embedded in fear of reproach rather than faith in love, and Brooke Logan, forced to defy the ruinous impact of her silence, oscillated between guard and despair, trying to explain her choices indeed as the substantiation of detriment stood before her in the form of a son who no longer trusted her, and Ridge, caught between the collapse of his father's heritage and the corrosion of his own identity as a moral arbitrator, entwined into tone reproach, questioning not only the opinions made on Hope's behalf but the innumerous moments when he'd chosen fidelity over integrity, and as pressures escalated, long-stewing resentments boiled to the face, with Steffi venting what numerous had allowed but no way dared to say, that the culture of secretiveness that had destroyed Hope's trust was the same culture that had enabled generations of emotional recklessness, tutoring them that responsibility was voluntary so long as the family name remained complete, and Thomas, whose once conduct had been shaped by the same distorted values, set up himself defying the uncomfortable verity that he'd been both a product and a perpetuator of the veritably system now crumpling, and as he watched Hope review herself with a strength born of pain, he was forced to reckon with the cost of a heritage that awarded deception and penalized vulnerability, and beyond the walls of the manse, the reproach strained into the broader world, sparking media enterprise, commercial insecurity, and rumored exchanges that questioned whether Forrester Creations could survive a reckoning that challenged its veritably foundation, because in a megacity erected on vision, the exposure of verity carried a uniquely destructive power, and as the company climbed to maintain its image, Hope's absence came a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a living memorial that no quantum of imprinting or damage control could abolish the mortal cost of treason, and it was during this period of bouleversement that Hope began to understand the full compass of what had been taken from her, not just certainty about her lineage, but the right to assent to her own story, the right to decide how important verity she could bear, and the quality of being trusted with reality rather than sheltered by falsehoods, and as she reused this loss, her grief converted into resoluteness, because for the first time, she honored that her worth wasn't contingent on where she came from or whose blood ran through her modes, but on the choices she made in the fate of treason, and this consummation marked the morning of a metamorphosis that would ripple outward, challenging everyone who had ever known her to defy their own conspiracy in maintaining comfortable lies, and when Hope eventually agreed to face her family again, it wasn't as the forgiving son they anticipated, but as a woman demanding responsibility, averring that justifications without honesty were pointless, and that mending couldn't do until the full verity was conceded. Indeed, if it destroyed what remained of the family's visions, and in that battle, as Eric plotted to articulate guilt without retreating into defense, and Brooke's gashes flowed not just from remorse but from the forming mindfulness that love without courage had failed her child, Hope made it clear that conciliation wasn't guaranteed, that remission wasn't an obligation, and that the heritage she intended to make would be defined not by silence but by translucency, and this protestation transferred shockwaves through the family, because it challenged the veritably rules by which they had always operated, rules that prioritized consanity over honesty and image over authenticity, and as Hope walked down formerly more, this time not in retreat but in assertion, it came apparent that the DNA test from hell had done further than expose a shocking treason. It had disassembled a generational cycle of secretiveness, forcing everyone left before to defy the uncomfortable verity that love, when stripped of honesty, becomes a tool of detriment, and as the Forrester dynasty stood at a crossroads, faced with the choice to evolve or collapse under the weight of its own falsehoods, Hope Spencer surfaced not as a victim of deception but as its reckoning, a living testament to the power of verity to destroy visions and, in its wake, offer the possibility of commodity far more fragile and far further real. As the reverberations of Hope Spencer's demand for responsibility continued to echo long after she left the room, the bold and the beautiful macrocosm entered a phase unlike any it had known before, one where silence no longer worked as a guard and where every character was forced to defy the uncomfortable reality that verity, formerly unleashed, couldn't be reshaped to fit tradition, because Hope's turn down to offer immediate remission shattered the long-standing belief that time alone could heal injuries foisted by deception, and rather introduced a new moral graveness into the family, one that demanded soul-searching rather than avoidance, and as days turned into weeks, the Forrester menage came a place of uneasy reflection rather than opulent distraction, with Eric Forrester spending long hours alone, reconsidering moments from his history that he'd formerly distributed as necessary negotiations but now honored as vital failures of courage, each memory cutting deeper than the last as he realized that the taradiddle he'd justified as protection had metastasized into generational detriment, shaping not only Hope's life but the moral compass of everyone who had followed his lead, and Brooke Logan, who had erected her survival on adaptability and reinvention, set up herself unraveling in a way she no way had ahead, because this time reinvention wasn't enough, and no quantum of tone mindfulness could abolish the knowledge that she had looked into her son's eyes for times while withholding a verity that would have altered Hope's understanding of herself, and Brooke's grief manifested not only in gashes but in a haunting mindfulness that love without honesty had bring her the trust she valued most, while Ridge Forrester, caught between the collapse of his father's myth and the corrosion of his own authority, began to defy the unsettling consummation that the righteousness he'd applied so confidently had frequently been picky, used to judge others while excusing the sins of those closest to him, and this reckoning fractured his sense of identity, forcing him to admit that his fidelity to heritage had dazed him to the emotional desolation it caused, and as the family plotted internally, the external world offered no reprieve, with rumors, enterprise, and rumored propositions circulating through Los Angeles, hanging to expose the reproach to an enduring public that had long consumed Forrester drama as entertainment but now tasted that commodity far more consequential had been exhumed, and at Forrester Creations, the absence of Hope's comforting presence and moral influence created a vacuum, enhancing being battles and destabilizing leadership as directors questioned whether the brand could survive a narrative so deeply entwined with treason, and amid this chaos, Hope herself began to suffer a metamorphosis that startled indeed her, as the pain that formerly hovered to paralyze her sluggishly stoned into purpose, because with distance came the clarity to fate that her sanguinity had no way been weakness but adaptability, and that her desire for verity didn't make her cruel or enduring but valorous, and as she explored a life untethered from the prospects that had defined her majority, she began to imagine a future not constrained by lineage or heritage, one where identity wasn't inherited but chosen, and this shift marked a profound elaboration, because for the first time Hope understood that mending didn't bear conciliation, and that boundaries weren't corrections but acts of tone preservation, and when Liam tried formerly further to bridge the distance between them, his love genuine but inadequate to mend the fracture, Hope brazened the painful reality that indeed the strongest connections couldn't survive when erected atop undetermined treason, and this consummation extended beyond love to family itself, as she conceded that love, no matter how deeply felt, couldn't excuse the denial of verity, and back at the manse, pressures escalated as Steffi pushed for a radical departure from the old ways, arguing that the family could no longer survive on half-trueness and strategic silences, and Thomas, decreasingly introspective, began to see his own history of manipulation through a harsher lens, fating that his conduct had been nurtured by a terrain that regularized deception as a means of control, and this tone mindfulness marked the morning of a slow, uncertain attempt at responsibility, indeed as he plotted with the fear that redemption might not be possible, and as each character